It was raining the day I stood in that dim room, my hands folded so tightly that my knuckles felt carved from marble. The fat drops splattered against the window panes, erasing the traffic beyond in slow-moving rivulets. Before me sat 3 professors, the review committee, barely disguising their collective impatience as they paged through my portfolio and read my proposal aloud in halting, dismissive tones. An in-depth study of the acoustic dynamics of hand-carved violins with practical application in luthiery. Professor Grazzi's voice was calm, a little too calm, the kind that sucked the warmth from my confidence. You're proposing to handcraft instruments rather than utilize industrial methods? I nodded. My tongue felt thick and useless. I glanced at the floor. I forced out. I believe the human touch, guided by intuition and tradition, creates something unique. Rome has centuries of history. Professor Bellini, whose eyeglasses conned the overhead lights, smirked faintly. That history is not our concern, she said. This is a modern conservatory. Our research must serve music as a science. My cheeks burned. But the best instruments, the ones that endure over centuries, are products of art, of patient care, not machines. Professor Russo, the youngest, swiveled in his chair and grimaced. Would you really spend these resources, this grant, on quaint nostalgia? There's no future in hand tools and old wood. They told me it was lovely, charming, almost poetic, but frivolous. There were cleverer, more deserving students, they said, a word so sharp I felt it like glass under my nails as I slid them anxiously across my portfolio's edge. They refused my proposal, politely, almost mechanically. The rain was heavier when I left, my shoes squeaking in the tiled hallways. The world outside washed out in a gray shimmer. I had prepared for this moment for months. My parents would be waiting, expecting good news, expecting some step forward toward some stable, reputable path. All the tension of hope and dread condensed into one sick, weightless feeling in my stomach. The street outside the conservatory was lined with old plane trees, leaves already yellowing in the autumn downpour. I walked quickly, dodging puddles, tugging my coat tighter to keep the chill from my bones. Down the alleys, laundry flapped on ancient iron lines, and the silhouettes of neighbors hunched together under umbrellas. Already I imagined their voices, my mother especially, gentle, resigned, careful to mask her disappointment, and afterward the conversation would leak to my aunts and uncles, to Marco across the street, to the whole scaffolding of faces that knew me as a clever but impractical child. I arrived home dripping, portfolio held awkwardly under my arm, and attempted to slip inside quietly. The small apartment was warm, but seemed to shrink with every step I took. My mother hovered over a simmering pot in the kitchen, apron strings undone. My father was at the table, hands wrapped around an espresso, reading the paper. She turned, smiling, her face radiating hope. "How did it go, Antonio?" For a second, I saw how easily I could lie. I could say they needed more time, or that the decision was deferred, but my mouth shaped the truth before I could stop. "They didn't like it. I'm sorry." My father's lips twisted in a way I hated, a look obscene after failed math tests, after broken promises, pity laced with disappointment. His voice was heavy. "They said no again?" "I'm trying," was all I managed, taking a seat at the table with my head lowered. I felt young, too young, all over again. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than my feet could carry me away from pity. By that evening, Cousin Fabio was at the door, a conspiratorial smirk on his lips. "Hey, Maestro," he said, not unkindly, placing exaggerated emphasis on the title. "Heard you're building your own violins now. I hope they play better than Marco's old radio." He laughed, and my father forced a weak smile. At dinner, my mother's sister leaned across the table, brushing crumbs from her lap. It's just tough, Antonino. There isn't money in that. Not like the old days. They build those things in factories now. Science, computers. But the old masters, Stradivari, Amati, I said, half-heartedly. But the room filled with dismissive murmurs. Those belong to the past. These days, musicians performed on sparkling carbon fiber marvels, precision milled and lacquered to perfection, every imperfection engineered out of existence. The months bled into each other. Jobs came and went, odd gigs at a bookshop, copying music for a music school. At night, in my small room overlooking the rooftops, I carved blocks of wood with a borrowed chisel, shaping backs and tops, burning my fingers ironing the purfling in, inhaling 1,000-years-old smell from maple sourced from a forgotten workshop in Trastevere. Each instrument was a promise I made to myself, even though the world outside considered it a child's daydream. The grind of ridicule and disappointment wore down my hope, but the ache of giving up would have hurt more. Friends I'd grown up with drifted away into jobs that made sense, that paid bills, that didn't require defending themselves at every family gathering. Sometimes in the afternoons, I'd visit the old artisan district, where the scent of turpentine still clung to cracked stone walls and faded shop signs. The luthiers there, wrinkled, half-blind, their workbenches carved with the history of their hands, let me watch. Sometimes handed me scraps, and once an "foolish boy," one called Alberto muttered, but there was a glimmer in his eye that said he remembered being foolish once too. Just remember, Wood, remembers everything. Your fear, your pride, you must let it sing. That winter, unable to scrape together course fees or rent for my leaky room, I packed a suitcase, tendered a slow goodbye to my parents, and left the city. My mother pressed a rosary into my palm. "You'll find your way in time," she whispered, though I knew she said it to herself as much as me. I worked where I could, teaching music, sweeping studios, hauling lumber in damp country towns. The years wore me down, not all at once, but in slow, crumbling pieces. For a time, I almost gave in, almost believed them all, that the world no longer made space for a craftsman's hands, that history was a museum, not a wound that keeps bleeding into the present. But I kept carving. Every free hour went into wood, planing, scraping, learning the syrupy patience the old men had taught me in Rome. The nights became years. Faces changed, cities changed. I drifted through Turin, Naples, Florence. I met musicians in smoky back rooms, swapped stories with violinists who remembered playing in their grandfather's attic. I bartered for cracked spruce, for a used set of tools, for tips on the acoustics of different varnishes. Eventually, my hands learned the language of curves and edges. Mistakes became rarer. The box of ruined backs and broken ribs shrank. I sent instruments to small competitions. Musicians, often young, stubborn as out of place as I felt, began to play them, at first with skepticism, then with small private joy. Rejections came, but so did acceptance, growing slowly from a murmur to something more substantial. An invitation from a conservatory in the north to give a lecture on tradition. An order from a mid-level soloist. Then, improbably, a letter from Milan, the chance to restore a 17th-century violin for display in a national exhibition. When I returned to Rome, the same city but somehow not the same, it was with a bad-up suitcase aged a decade and a violin case of my own design lacquered violin pegs gleaming beneath the soft glow of the street lamps. My clothes were plain, my shoes still worn, but in my memory burned the sound of applause from far-off cities. And a secret thrill of craftsmen who nodded at my work, sometimes even smiled and called me "colega." The neighborhood seemed smaller now, as if shrunk by time. The familiar sounds, children shouting, the accordionist on the corner, the clang of traffic welcomed me and set me on edge all at once. I let myself into my parents' old apartment. My mother stared at me for a moment at the doorway, and I saw the years etched under her eyes, softened by relief. "Antonio?" Her voice trembled as she pulled me into a tight embrace. "My God, you're back!" My father looked at me over his reading glasses, cautious, guarded. "I brought something for you," I said, and handed him a thick envelope. Commission papers, the Milan exhibition's catalog, a letter from a famous soloist who'd played the violin I made and wanted another. He flipped through them, disbelief flickering over his weathered face. My mother beamed and pressed her fingers to her lips. Within days, word spread as easily as the news of my failure had years earlier. First, it seeped into the corridor, La Signora at the stairway, asking if it was really true. Then to the piazza, the barista never quite smiling, but pouring my espresso with more care. I stayed in Rome, setting up a cramped workshop in a sunlit room above the old bookshop. People arrived in twos and threes, most out of curiosity, some with forgotten cellos or battered guitars under one arm. Fabio stopped by, peering around the clutter. "So it's not a hobby any longer?" he joked, but something like respect curled the corners of his lips. He set his hands on a half-carved viola. "You really made this?" "From scratch," I said, tapping the grain with my thumb. Every curve. The big moment came sooner than I expected. Word arrived that the National Youth Orchestra, an ensemble with roots stretching into Rome's aristocratic past, would be debuting a new work at the Santa Cecilia Hall. They wanted to commission a set of violins. Not just any set, but hand-carved, uniquely Roman, shaped by tradition. When the first ones were finished, 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, I carried them myself to the old conservatory for inspection, stomach twisting as I rang the doorbell. The same committee that had rejected my proposal so many years before sat in the echoing foyer. Professor Grazzi appeared older now, thinner, with liver spots on the back of his hands. Professor Bellini still wore those sharp glasses, although she looked like she had lost a step, distracted as she leafed through documents on her permuted desk. Professor Russo greeted me without memory, waving distractedly. They examined the instruments, skeptical at first, prodding at the F-holes, scrutinizing the gleam of the varnish, weighing them in the hands as if guessing the intent behind every decision carved into the wood. A young violinist from the orchestra hoisted one to his shoulder. He played something small, a thrumming passage from Vivaldi,